In this episode, we will continue our discussion on the impacts of affirmative action.
This is The Hidden Critique, where we discuss art, race, and higher education at the intersection of an MFA. I'm Marlon Tobias, pronouns he, him.
And I'm Krystle and Lemonias, pronouns she, her.
Welcome to our show.
All right, so today we're bringing on another scholar that can give us more insight on the impacts of affirmative action, but this time from more of a historical context. So today we will be talking with Dr. Kim Butorac, who is an assistant professor of political science who specializes in the history of Black politics and Black political thought. He received his PhD in political science, and his research and teaching interests center on the history and politics of race, particularly questions of law and race, racial capitalism, and the politics of resistance. His current project, From Slavery to Prisons, is a transatlantic political and intellectual history of resistance to enslavement. Told from perspective of those most affected by slavery, free and enslaved Black people, this work shows how resistance to enslavement altered the making of law and race in ways that still structure modern policing, protest law, and popular responses to the anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter. So without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Kim Butorac.
All right, well, welcome, Sean. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely,
Yes.
Absolutely. So a part of this series of talking about the impacts of affirmative action, a lot of heavy information and heavy content. And so thank you so much for, again, coming on to really talk about it in a way that's digestible for all of us to understand. But before we get into the nitty gritty, what we do here, because mental health is important in life, especially when you're living the artist, entrepreneur, educator lifestyle, we want to begin with a simple question, and that is, Sean, how is your heart?
My heart is tired. It has been a long, long year of these decisions, and there are only more to come. So I have to pace myself, and I have to remind myself, like to take it all in stride. But right now, yeah, I'm feeling a little tired.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that and being honest and authentic with that, because not every day is going to be sunshine and rainbows, and with a lot of things that are happening in the world today, it's important to definitely be honest with your emotions and having the strength to admit that and say, hey, this marathon of a life, I'm at the stage where I'm feeling kind of fatigued. And that is so important to assess, as well as feeling happy and all joyous and all that stuff. So thank you so much. How about you, Chris? How's your heart?
I'm feeling pretty exhausted as well. There's a lot happening in the world. The semester has been very eventful on campus, and I'm ready for another break to hopefully reassess and rest and come back a little bit stronger in the new year. I'm hoping that's the case. How about you, Marlon?
Yes. Well, I'm feeling a little bit, I would say, similar sentiments of the fatigue that I feel. We're all educators, higher ed educators, and we're all at that time also of the year where things are starting to wind down as far as the semester. But because things are starting to wind down, that means that there's a lot of backlog things that we also have to tend to in regards to our curriculum and then students and then all the things. So that is causing a little bit of fatigue, but there is a small glimmer of hope that I always try to carry with intention and remind myself in these times that, it's just temporary, it's just seasonal, and there is going to be a time when the pressure is going to be released, and that is when rest can occur.
Yeah. And, I think that's such a great point to end on in regards to how we're feeling, because I think it highlights how the trajectory of the world that we go in phases. And sadly, this phase is in a sense, deconstructing and finding the energy to fight again. And, thinking about the history and the trajectory of affirmative action, there's so much to understand in order to have the resilience to keep moving. And maybe that's just where we can start. Sean, if you could share a little bit about the history and just explain what is the argument of, I know that you have mentioned in regards to whiteness is property, and even if you'd like to go into what is affirmative action.
Yeah. So, affirmative action is basically just a legal principle that says that we respond to disparities by creating remedies on the basis of whatever that disparity came from, right? And then most oftentimes we think about race, but of course, affirmative action can be used in response to other social characteristics or criteria. But whiteness as property, really, I think helps us understand the backlash against affirmative action because of the ways that it challenges and disrupts whiteness. And this is really what Cheryl Harris is doing with the concept of whiteness as property. Cheryl Harris was a critical race theorist early in the years of the crits who's writing in the 90s, right? And she's thinking about whiteness through the lens of property. And without going into too much detail, I'll try to keep it pretty simple. Harris is thinking about the property as a legal concept, right? And there are different ideas depending on who you talk to, like how we define property. What is property? And I think the way that most of us think about it is like something that has value, something that we can attach value to and therefore can be sold or exchanged, right? Like durable goods. But property works in other ways too. And the law recognizes other forms of property. So property can define social relations. So each of us has some kind of advanced degree that confers upon us a certain status that defines our relationship to each other, to our students. And courts have recognized that as a form of property. But even more broadly, right, the court also recognizes that property is itself a form of expectation, or property forms the basis of expectation. And I think that's really where we've ended up today with whiteness as a form of property, that, as whiteness has shifted from something that has sort of less overt value in the way of saying, only white men are eligible to become citizens of the US, today whiteness forms sort of the backbone of a very concrete set of expectations that white people and people who identify with whiteness have about the world and what they deserve, what they're entitled to.
That is very fascinating. It was interesting to me that this idea of whiteness is property came up, and it kind of is around also in this case, can be identified as you kind of shared in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Could you share a little bit about that case and how it showed up in that particular decision?
Yeah, I think when we think of Plessy v. Ferguson, we think of separate but equal, right? That is sort of the famous line from the decision that Brown eventually overturns. But there's this really fascinating argument that Plessy's attorney makes before the Supreme Court. And he basically goes and he says, look, because Plessy couldn't be seated in the all-white train car, he was denied the sort of status, the reputation, the value of that reputation that comes with being white. And I think this is just so interesting, right? That you have an attorney before the Supreme Court who is saying, like, look, the thing that gives whiteness value as a form of property is that status that it confers and the recognition that comes with that status. And so in this way, right, like you literally have someone before the court who is saying, like, look, this is property as a form of status with recognizable value that people are, even, right, in Plessy's case, like a white passing Black man are being denied.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, how does that then connect to affirmative action and how we're also understanding it today?
Yeah, I think understanding that whiteness is a form of property that creates a certain set of expectations about how one moves through the world, what one is like entitled to, right? That is why so many white people or people who identify with whiteness are so hostile to affirmative action, because affirmative action tries to correct those disparities. It tries to challenge that status and in place create equity. And for those who are used to moving through the world in a particular kind of way with a certain set of expectations, right? Like that is disruptive, and people don't like disruption.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I kind of want to now reel it back in and hone in on education, right? Because we are educators. We do have educational components to our podcast. So could you also, while talking about whiteness as property, explain the connections between whiteness as property and public education?
I guess the way that I would think about it is that I think there's a conception of education in this country that it is one of sort of the great equalizers, that, you know, with enough kind of grit and self-determination that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and achieve some version of the American dream. And education, we understand, as being one of the really key mechanisms for achieving that, right? I think, of course, the material reality of education in this country is that there are vast disparities in terms of the quality of education that people receive, educational outcomes, and that those disparities a lot of the time track along racial lines. And so for white people, that means that there is a particular set of expectations when it comes to what their educational environment looks like, the access to resources that they have, the kinds of people that they are around or not around in a lot of cases. And so in that way, right, I think, you know, education really forms the backbone of this set of expectations that folks ascribe to whiteness. And I guess just the last thing I would add, and we can leave this in or not, right, is like, one of the ways that we are kind of like socialized into race, that we like learn race, I think, as a form of like common sense that a lot of us use to make sense of the world and to navigate through the world, comes through education. And so preserving those all white spaces or predominantly white spaces when it comes to education becomes a way of insulating whiteness from critique, from challenge. And I think that's why, you know, the fight over race and education has been particularly fraught.
I see. And when also talking about education, you mentioned Cheryl Harris and her publishing Whiteness as Property. She talks about Brown versus Board of Education decision as well. So can you also kind of unpack that and talk about its relevance to impact also on affirmative action?
Yeah, totally. I mean, Brown is one of those really interesting decisions because it's really held up as like one of the great moments for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And in many ways, Brown was and is a remarkable decision. But the closer we get to Brown, I think the clearer the faults with the decision also become. So Brown ruled that race-based segregation in public education was a violation of the 14th Amendment. And the way that they arrived at that conclusion was on the basis of the psychological harm that it caused for Black children. And that's absolutely true. But what the court didn't take into account in Brown was the material effects of race-based segregation in education. So quality of schools, educational outcomes, like the things that many of us would think about as effects of racial segregation, the court's not talking about that in Brown. And in that way, it's really ambiguous, right? It doesn't provide a necessarily a clear through line then to something like affirmative action that really is thinking about the material conditions, like what the educational space looks like, who is there. And Brown was made even more ambiguous by the fact that, you know, a year later in Brown 2, which many people don't talk about, the court comes back and they say, you know what, schools, you only have to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And I ask my students, I'm like, y'all, what does all deliberate speed mean?
I was just about to ask that. I was just like, can you explain what that is? That's a new term that.
So turns out it means whatever you want, right? Like do it at your own pace. And the reason for that was that nobody was listening to the court, or I should say that like particularly Southern schools and officials were just resisting openly. They were openly defying the court. And they're like, this looks bad for us. This looks really bad. And so we have to figure out a way to course correct. And they say, okay, desegregate, but desegregate with all deliberate speed. So that leaves us in a really weird place, right?
Yeah.
A really, I would say, not just a weird place, but a very, I would say, dangerously weird place, in particular with how history played out after that, and just the quality of education and the disparity of the quality of education that it produced, and the residual effects that we still see today. And I'm also just thinking about how that played out in the location and also the funding of maybe like property taxes and the community actually pouring into the educational system. I see how it makes a little bit more sense, because I was thinking about in school when learning about the Brown versus Board of Education decision and the concept of separate but equal, but then seeing how unequal it was, that term, it adds more clarity to why history played out the way it did.
Yeah. And I think property taxes are such a good example, right? Because schools are, for the most part, funded based on property taxes. So depending on the value of the homes where you live, schools can have access to significantly different amounts of money. And the issue is that like value, which we take to be neutral, is itself like a racialized concept. How we understand value, what we attach value to, including whiteness, right, is all rooted in race. And it shows in the numbers too. This is more than theory, right? You know, there's something like a 2 to 3% appraisal gap for identical homes between Black and white homeowners. If you live in a neighborhood that is more than 50% Black, your home is by default worth almost 25% less than if you live in an all-white neighborhood. And that then translates into how much your home is worth. Yeah. And that value then translates to your property taxes. Those property taxes are what's going to fund schools. And the even bigger issue there is like, or I don't know if it's bigger, but the other issue there, right, is like that home that you own, the value of that home, the equity that you get from that home, that is the single greatest source of intergenerational wealth for a household. And that's the biggest determinant of upward mobility, of whether or not you stay as part of that upwardly mobile class. And so it branches out, right, into all of these different issues.
Wow. That's so poignant when talking about that. And it reminds me, or makes me think of this. I want to take an excerpt out of Cheryl Harris's writing. It said, white workers often identify primarily as white rather than as workers because it is through their whiteness that they are afforded access to a host of public, private, and psychological benefits. And I want to say it kind of reminded me of that when you were talking about property taxes and values. And that's also an example of just how whiteness as property has kind of seeped into other realms of life here. So can you unpack that a little bit more?
Totally. I mean, we can look at the wealth gap today. It's bigger than it's ever been, right? There is more wealth inequality in the world than we've ever seen before. And somebody who had never encountered race in the US before would probably be like, why aren't Black and white workers getting together and like organizing and doing something about this, right? And some workers are, but a lot of workers aren't. And there's also not a lot of interracial solidarity between those workers. And it's exactly because of whiteness. And here Harris is referencing W.E.B. Du Bois, who in Black Reconstruction develops this idea of the wages of whiteness. And Du Bois basically says that white people, in addition to getting like material benefits from being white, right, like living in an all-white neighborhood, having your home be worth more, going to higher quality schools with access to more resources, they also get a psychological wage from being white. And that is knowing that no matter how low you are on that class totem pole, right, however low you are in the hierarchy, that you are always above the Black worker. And that confers a kind of like psychological security that means that the white worker is always white before they are a worker.
That makes a lot of sense. To kind of go a little bit deeper into this other decision that I took a moment to look into, how does the Wygant decision impact the property interest in whiteness? If you think that is useful to discuss here.
Yeah, Wygant was an affirmative action case that dealt with layoffs of public school teachers.
Yeah.
And basically what the school district did was they decided to retain less senior Black teachers because they felt that that diversity and representation within the classroom was really important for students. And a more senior white teacher who was laid off decided to sue the school board. And the court basically came back and they said, like, hey, look, you are totally within your right to try to retain a diverse group of teachers because you're right, that's good for students. That diversity is important. But the means that you are using to achieve that, basically, right, isn't what the court would say. I don't have a less technical term for this. Isn't sufficiently narrowly tailored, is what they would say. In other words, right, like you're using too blunt of a tool to try to achieve this outcome, and so they overturned the school board's decision, basically. So basically, what this meant is a whole bunch of Black teachers who were less senior because of prior discrimination in hiring, right? These are folks who might have otherwise been senior teachers, but were not, right? Were laid off. The result is basically that you have the settled expectations of this senior white teacher are being elevated over the goal of racial equality.
Wow.
So that just sounds like now time is against us.
Hearing about what you've just broken down, now I'm like, how does that then connect with, because we have the education system K through 12, and then we have higher ed. How does this decision impact the ability of affirmative action programs to delegitimate the assumptions surrounding existing inequity? How do you feel that then impacts that?
It makes me feel insane because we've suddenly entered a world where white people are the victims.
Truth.
And like,
truth.
I don't know what to do with. I don't know what. I don't know what to do with that. Right? It's like we've suddenly entered a space where, in trying to promote racial equality, we have victimized all of these poor white people who have all of these settled expectations, right? Taking it all the way back to whiteness as property. They have a certain set of expectations about how the world works for them. And when the world doesn't work for them that way, they flip out. And the court here is basically saying, like, look, your expectations were disrupted in a way that they should not have been.
Damn. That is heavy.
Yes. And I mean, you've provided language to what's going on in the air, right? I'm afraid to say this, but like it reminds me of it makes me think of the new term of a Karen, where it's just like all of a sudden there's like a reverse victimization kind of going on. And the bigger point is that me as a person of color, as a Black person, has been systematically placed in this situation where I am in this place of dependency, and I'm trying to get out. And I feel like that point is lost when this kind of, I want to say, reverse victimization is going on and being played out. So thank you for providing the language for really what that is, right? And understanding that, and also providing the context of the emotion that produces.
What's even more wild, right, is like we haven't even fully begun to address the problem, and people are already freaking out. Like, can you imagine what the reaction would be if we were to actually fully implement a program of affirmative action that really substantively addressed issues of racial inequality and the kinds of expectations that would be disrupted. The way that whiteness as property would be disrupted if we were to do that. And it would look much, much more radical than the things that people are already fully losing it over.
Oh my God. That is just so poignant. I don't know. But we're going to take a section to see what your hopes are around this conversation. But before we do that, yes, Marlon.
So what would you consider radical? You mentioned the word or an action that would be more radical. So what would you consider a more radical step towards equity and equality be?
I think it goes all the way back to Brown, right? And it goes back to the fact that the court was the only way that the court in Brown was able to arrive at a unanimous decision in the way that it did was by focusing on this issue of psychological harm to Black children. And that is 100% an issue that we should take seriously. But the psychological harm doesn't capture the material issues, the quality of the schools, the educational outcomes for those students. It's like the court seemed to think that like if Black children were just in the room with white children, that somehow like that would be the solution. And I'm here to say that like that is not the only solution.
Right.
Like diversity in classrooms does produce better outcomes for all students. That is true. But a student in an inferior quality school is still going to have a poorer outcome than a student most of the time than a student in a school with more resources. And so for me, it has to start with the radical redistribution of those resources.
That makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. And, to go a little bit, to segue a bit, but it's something that I think is very imperative to this conversation. We have this idea of the model minority and the myth around it. So tell me, how does whiteness as property help us understand the fact that the recent affirmative action case primarily involves non-white applicants?
Yeah, it's interesting here that we're dealing in large part with Asian American applicants, high achieving students who at Harvard at least make up a disproportionate percentage of the student population. And historically, one of the kind of things that's been ascribed to that group is this idea of like the model minority, right? That no matter your race, if you are high achieving, if you apply yourself, you will get ahead. And this is also used to point to other racial groups to basically say, like, why aren't you doing better? There's a critical race theorist, Claire Jean Kim. She has this idea of racial triangulation. And she's thinking about how white, Black, and Asian American people are all kind of related to each other, how race puts them in different relationships with each other. And she talks a lot about the model minority myth. And she says, this is a way to valorize Asian Americans, to say, like, look how good they are. And like Black students, why aren't you better? Right. So it's a way of, uplifting one group in order to denigrate another group, but also to pit those two groups against each other. And I think that's exactly what's happening in this case, right? Is that you have Asian American applicants who are looking at affirmative action programs that are, let's say, benefiting Black applicants, for example. And rather than interrogating the system of whiteness that's at the root of that system, they're looking at this very small percentage, right, of Black applicants, and they're saying that they're the problem suddenly.
Right.
It basically leads us to misunderstand, misrepresent the situation.
Interesting. And so I wonder, though, does that model minority myth apply to other cultural groups other than Asians?
It can sometimes. I think there's always like the example of somebody who, the Karen in the room says, like, well, you don't sound Black, right?
Okay, so that's how it shows up for Black people or African descendant people.
Yeah, it's one way it could show up. I think what's crucial about like the model minority myth is that it's a way of both uplifting a group while also ostracizing that group. Like you are so good for being X, but you are at the end of the day still X. You are not white. You are not at the top of the racial hierarchy.
Wow.
So now with the Supreme Court decision, what do you think the impact of the model minority myth will have in the future now that we're here?
I mean, what really worries me is the potential here for it to erode interracial solidarity, right? I think the decision here to overturn, basically eviscerate affirmative action in the way that the court has sends a signal to students of color that not only does your identity not matter as an applicant or shouldn't be considered as an applicant, but that it's basically a zero-sum conflict between you and other students of color. And I think that is terrifying to me because it stokes conflict when the real conflict that we should be concerned with is with whiteness and with challenging whiteness. And it's basically a diversion, right? It's a distraction.
I was just thinking that it sounds like it's just going to further distract us from the root of the cause or the actual disease and have us still focusing on the symptoms or still trying to tend to the symptoms. So I'm really glad that you said that.
It makes me now want to consider, I know you mentioned going back to board versus education as this place of how do we really move forward, which you're suggesting going back. Is there anything you would suggest for an individual with all this information you've empowered us with, specifically those in higher ed or even as educators that may listen to this, that are graduates in K through 12 education? How do we utilize this knowledge and put it forward in action?
I think it just starts with recognizing how pervasive whiteness is in higher education and the way that whiteness has, again, created all of these expectations that we have institutionalized, that we have naturalized, that we don't question, that we don't recognize as being racialized expectations based on whiteness. But even though they aren't as overtly racial as they used to be, they're still based around whiteness. They're still built to protect whiteness. And so I think it just starts with first recognizing all of the ways that whiteness is cut through the institutions that we're part of. And once we've started to engage in that recognition and have those difficult conversations and naming it for what it is, that's when we can start to think about institutional change and what we need to do to disrupt those expectations. But given the context, right, I think it's going to require a lot of savviness. I think it's going to require a lot of strategy and creativity because we know that a lot of American political institutions, especially the Supreme Court, right, like aren't going to be receptive to that.
Right.
John Roberts has famously said that like the best way to stop racial discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And that's him talking about like affirmative action, right? Which is actually meant to address racial discrimination. And so knowing where we are and what we're up against, I think is going to require us to think creatively and radically about what it is we can and can't do right now.
To summarize, do you think if I say that you're suggesting to acknowledge and organize, would you say that's a good distillation of what you?
I think that's a great way to sum it up because I don't know how to be concise.
All right, guys, you heard it here. Learn what you got to learn. Listen to this podcast and organize. It's a recurrent theme here. The best way to move through is to get together with those that are looking for change and for equity that includes equality, and really use this knowledge, putting it into action. So thank you again, Sean.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we're at the point of the show where we want to hear from you, the listeners. Join us on Discord, the link found in our show description, to share your thoughts on these two questions. 1, what resources or funding have you seen already being pulled back since the recent Supreme Court decision? And 2, what do you feel has impacted your educational pursuits?
Thank you for listening to our episode. The Hidden Critique is produced and hosted by us, Krystle and Lemonias and Marlon Tobias. Episodes are edited by Kirsten Pettifor. Original music composed by Cesar Presa.
If you like the show, you can review and rate this podcast via Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also like, subscribe, and comment on our YouTube page.
For exclusive bonus content, subscribe to our Patreon at The Hidden Critique.
Or join the Hidden Critiques Discord page to engage directly with us, the host, and build community with fellow listeners.